Hi, my name's Christian Laki. I founded a support group on Facebook called Sydney Survivors of Narcissistic Parental Abuse Support Group, and I've written a testimony about my own experiences with a narcissistic parent. I'm using the analogy of or the metaphor of the magic flute, the Queen of the Night's character, as my mother was an opera singer, and that was really her defining role, and I relate that to my experiences. I do have an author's note as well as citations and a bibliography, which I'm not going to read. I'll just read the content. But if anybody's interested in seeing the document and maybe looking at some of the sources and citations, then I'll make that available. Maybe just message me and I can send that out. So here we go. My Mother, the Queen of the Night, a long-form memoir of narcissistic parental abuse, coercive control, intergenerational harm, and the fight for my father's dignity. A comfortable lie is believed without evidence. No amount of evidence can convince people of an uncomfortable truth. Overture. This investigative memoir examines the lifelong impact of narcissistic parental abuse as a patterned form of relational harm, including emotional invalidation, gaslighting, coercive control, and scapegoating, alongside the preservation of image at the expense of reality and relationship. Through a hybrid methodology that combines personal narrative with interdisciplinary research, the memoir traces the continuity of these dynamics from childhood parentification and bodily shame to adult sabotage, allegations that were, to my knowledge, not substantiated, contested decision-making, and later life struggles over care, finance, and legal authority during my father's decline. It also examines legal systems abuse, institutional deference, and the intergenerational transmission of coercive harm, including efforts to prevent the repetition of these patterns in the next generation. The title draws on the Queen of the Night from Mozart's Magic Flute, used here as a metaphor for the intersection of performance, authority, and maternal control through which lived experience is interpreted. Prelude, The Last Breath. My father passed away quietly on Friday evening, just after sunset. The room was dim, and the atmosphere felt suspended, as though time itself had paused to witness the end. When my daughter and I entered, my mother had already left, and it was just the three of us, my father, my daughter, and I. We played his favourite music, and I placed cream gently on his face, as I had done many times in the final months, and his breathing slowed, then it stopped. I believe he held on to see us. I believe he chose to leave this world with the people who loved him without condition. His death was quiet. The story that led to it was not. Act 1, The Queen of the Night. My mother's defining role on stage was the Queen of the Night. Her voice could fill an opera house, but it could also silence a child. On stage, she was brilliance, from the audience glamour, from distance, elegance, and authority. But I saw something else. As a child, I watched her check her reflection in every passing window, adjusting hair, posture, expression, as though the world were a mirror and she its centre. Image was not incidental, but it was structural. Perception mattered more than experience, appearance more than reality. Any contradiction, boundary, independent perspective, or emotional need not organised around her was treated as a threat. This was not simply vanity, but what the literature describes as the preservation of self-image at the expense of relationship. The title is not a diagnosis, but it's a metaphor, a way of understanding a pattern in which performance, control, and image consistently outweighed relationship, accountability, and care. It also grounded in the role itself, or is grounded in the role itself. Mozart's Die Zauberflöte, 1791, The Magic Flute, aligns musical language and psychological character. In his operas, vocal style is not a mere ornament, but a primary vehicle of interiority. Character is encoded as much in musical form as in text. The Queen's two arias trace a striking transformation. In O zittere nicht, mein lieber Sohn, O do not tremble, my dear son, she appears as a grieving yet composed maternal figure, a lyrical legato line ending coherence and a sense of legitimacy. In der Hölle Rache kocht in meinem Herzen, in der Hölle Rache kocht in meinem Herzen, German's tough, the vengeance of hell boils within my heart. This coherence fractures, signaling a radical shift both musically and psychologically. One of the most demanding coloratura arias in the repertoire, it pushes the soprano to extremes of range, speed, and intervallic leap. These demands are not merely technical but expressive. Musical excess becomes emotional excess. Where 18th century convention often used coloratura to signify brilliance, Mozart renders it as unstable. Fragmented vocal lines, abrupt dynamic contrasts, and discontinuous figures signal agitation and loss of control. The voice ceases to stabilize meaning and instead comes to index psychological rupture. For me, this rupture registered as something like my mother laughing at my suffering, an effect I experienced as a form of demonic laughter, where expression tips into something perceived as hostile or inhuman. The text intensifies this reading. The Queen commands her daughter to kill or be disowned. Maternal authority becomes coercion. Care becomes conditional. As Hunter, 2015, notes, Mozart's operas repeatedly expose the instability beneath fixed social roles. More broadly, the Queen has been read as a figure of excess, opposed to Enlightenment ideals of reason and order. Her musical language enacts this. Excess in rage, speed, and ornament mirrors excess in affect. In opera, however, excess is contained. It is staged, structured, and bounded in time, resolved through musical and dramatic closure. In life, there's no such containment. For her, the emotional register of performance seemed to extend beyond the stage. For me, there was no framing structure, no orchestral logic, no libretto, no written solution. What functions in opera as stylized expression became, in lived experience, something enduring in its psychological consequences. Act 2. Childhood in the Queen's Shadow. My mother told the story of my birth as a cautionary tale. I was a difficult breech delivery, she would say, her tone carrying a quiet accusation, as though I had begun burdening her before I had properly entered the world. According to her, my birth marked the point at which everything unravelled. She framed it at a critical moment in her career as the reason she never returned to the Australian Opera. In her telling, I had cost her everything, her role, her momentum, and her place in that world. Years later, I encountered a contrary archive. Among her papers was a letter from the company, warm, formal, unequivocal, welcoming her return after maternity leave. There was no rejection, only an opportunity she did not take. This disjunction exposed the instability of the narrative I had inherited, a repetition that had hardened into truth, performing explanatory work while displacing responsibility. In retrospect, this structure mirrors the dramaturgy of the Queen of the Night. In her first aria, O zittere nicht, legato coherence sustains an image of maternal legitimacy. In the second, Der Hölle Rache, that coherence fractures into volatility and excess. What appears as continuity conceals rupture. Similarly, the story of my birth functioned as a stabilizing line, an interpretive frame that made contradictions appear coherent, even as it relied on distortion. I came to see how completely I had become cast as a scapegoat within the structure. In any disagreement, the narrative was fixed. I was wrong, cruel, and somehow at fault for naming what was happening. In narcissistic family systems, scapegoating preserves the central image by relocating conflict into one designated body, with research linking these dynamics to long-term psychological consequences, including anxiety, depression, and identity disturbance. My mother's judgments were presented as truth and reinforced through authority. Over time, this came to resemble gaslighting. I was pushed to doubt my own perception of events until the boundary between what I experienced and what I was told had happened became unstable. This was not confusion in the ordinary sense, but a sustained dislocation. Events were reframed, minimized, or denied, producing a persistent and corrosive divide between reality as lived and reality as enforced. Over time, these judgments did not remain external. They became the structure of my thinking. My inner voice grew automatic, relentless, and self-attacking. Life is bad. I cannot do it. Something is wrong with me. I experienced myself not only as flawed, but as fundamentally defective. Too much, not enough, wrong in ways I could not correct. These were not occasional thoughts, but ingrained reflexes, shaping perception before reflection was even possible. The psychological consequences were cumulative, pervasive, and enduring. I developed symptoms later understood as major depression and obsessive-compulsive disorder. These were not inexplicable defects of temperament, but can be understood as consistent with research demonstrating associations between childhood maltreatment and adverse adult mental health outcomes, including the effects of chronic emotional invalidation, sustained negative evaluation, and prolonged insecurity. It took decades of therapy and medication to begin to recognize that this pattern was learned rather than inherent, to separate what had been installed from what was actually mine. And even then, its force did not disappear, but required constant interruption, rendering time in my mother's presence often unbearable. The consequences did not resolve. I continued to rely on significant medication and to live with the enduring effects of severe psychological trauma. Other dynamics were more subtle, but no less revealing. Sometimes she said she loved me most as an innocent baby, before I had any will or autonomy. The implication was that the preferred version of me was one without agency or voice. This suggested a limited tolerance for independence. As soon as I asserted myself, tension emerged. What should have been recognized as development, voice, will, and self-expression was instead experienced as disruption. As in Mozart's reworking of convention, the voice becomes most volatile at the moment that it finds force. Here too, the emergence of voice unsettled rather than stabilized the system. Correction could be sudden and disproportionate. I was slapped for dropping a freshly ironed shirt. My body was mocked as being overweight and embarrassing. I was told I made her ill for behaviour that amounted to trying to conceal my stomach by folding my arms in public. She would then dramatically take Valium, claiming I was the cause of her distress. Here again, cause and effect were narratively arranged, much like musical figures displaced from stable tonal grounding. When I reacted with distress, confusion, or protest, those responses were treated not as consequences, but as evidence of pathology. I was sent to psychologists to determine what was wrong after I began to name her behaviour as harmful. The problem was never the originating action, but my response to it. Another patterned the atmosphere of my childhood, a persistent sense of impeding catastrophe. Illness, sometimes real, often exaggerated, produced cycles of crisis and dissipation, sustaining a heightened field of attention. From an early age, she spoke of dying, creating an environment saturated with fragility and threat. Like coloratura pushed to its limits, intensity became both technique and expression. Eventually, I stopped reacting. That refusal came at a cost, but it marked one of the first boundaries that I held. A pattern emerges. Experience, reaction, reinterpretation. They rarely aligned. What I lived, what I felt, and what I was told about both did not align. What I lived, what I felt, and what I was told about both did not align. As in the Queen's second aria, the voice ceases to stabilize meaning and instead indexes rupture. Only later did I understand this is not an isolated contradiction, but a systematic mode of organizing reality itself. Act 3, Parentification and Distorted Reality. Better have a sip of coffee. It's a long paper. But thank you for listening if you're still listening. Okay, my childhood was further complicated by early exposure to adult realities. I was not equipped to process these. When I was 9, my mother began a relationship outside the marriage. At the time, she portrayed my father as irrationally jealous while casting herself as an innocent victim. Years later, she acknowledged the affair casually, even laughing about it. Laughter to me that carried the same demonic quality I had come to associate with the Queen of the Night. I was placed in the position of holding and reconciling competing narratives between my parents. I became the container for information I could neither process nor resolve. This was parentification, the imposition of emotional responsibilities that belonged to adults, not children. She told me my father was forcing her to have sex, an account I was not really in a position to verify. She insisted I was her friend and that she could tell me anything, which blurred all boundaries between parent and child. At the same time, I was being sexually abused by an older child, making everything more confusing. I didn't even understand what sex was, yet I was being exposed to it by 2 older people. To account for my persistent distress and anger towards her, she's presented a narrative to others that, from my perspective, misrepresented my position, namely that I resented her for failing to protect me from the older child. However, that person later apologized to me, which meant a great deal, and I've forgiven them. On that basis, I understand that claim as inconsistent with my experience and as serving to preserve a particular version of events. The instability extended beyond conversation into the structure of our lives. She separated from my father, and we sold the family home so she could move to Germany to build a new life and pursue a career with her new partner. I was misled by both parents. My mother consistently cast herself as the innocent party and my father as the antagonist, yet she left me to live with him. And when she later returned, she claimed it was out of love for me. I would eventually learn it was because her partner had left her. My father was not simply contradicted, but steadily diminished, his authority undermined, his perception reworked, and his role reduced within a structure that could not tolerate autonomy alongside it. Years later, watching Richard E. Grant's autobiographical film Wawa, 2005, which I came to understand reflects his experience with a narcissistic mother, I recognized my own experience almost exactly, including witnessing my mother with another man in a car. When I later met Grant, we spoke briefly, and with a quiet sense of shared recognition, agreed that we both had the same mother. When I told my father at the time, she dismissed it as childish misunderstanding. It was a kiss goodbye, which clearly it was not. There was no stable ground. Truth shifted depending on context. Responsibility moved. Meaning was continually revised. Even my achievements were reframed. When I was accepted into a prestigious high school, I believed I'd performed well in the interview. She insisted the only reason I'd been accepted was because of her reputation as an opera singer, diminishing my effort and claiming the success as her own. These patterns didn't end with childhood. They persisted, reappearing in adult relationships where independence was experienced not as development but as threat. Act 4. Adulthood, Love and Sabotage. Adulthood did not dissolve the pattern. It relocated it. When I formed intimate relationships, they were not simply recognized as such. They were treated as disruptions to an established hierarchy. A partner represented independent loyalty, an alternative center of gravity, and the possibility of an emotional life beyond my mother's orbit. My partner, whom I would later marry and have a child with, was met not with openness, but with overt criticism. My mother remarked that she had a very broad Australian accent and told her directly, "Europeans and Australians do not mix." Her speech, her background and legitimacy were openly belittled. These remarks did not occur in isolation. They formed part of a broader pattern in which cultural hierarchy was asserted as a form of personal authority. Europeans were positioned as inherently more refined, more sophisticated, more legitimate, claims that defined my partner and her family as inferior by default. In this context, my mother's identity as a former opera singer, presented as culturally elite, functioned as both justification and reinforcement of these judgments. Status was not merely claimed, it was used to organize value, determining whose voice carried weight and whose could be dismissed. This aligns with coercive relational dynamics in which authority is established, not through mutual recognition, but through hierarchical narratives that define others as lesser. When I confronted this, it was denied, and my father defended her. She would never say that. My mother insisted I was not clear in my mind, attributing the account to depression. I was told I had misheard, misunderstood, or imposed meanings that were never intended. This is consistent with patterns identified in the literature as gaslighting in its adult form, in which control is maintained through the destabilization of perception. For decades, an apology remained out of reach. Even gestures resembling remorse were structured around self-exoneration. I had misunderstood, misheard, been too sensitive, or should leave her alone because she's unwell. The details shifted, the underlying logic did not. She could not be wrong. Not because no wrong had occurred, but because acknowledgement would threaten the image on which everything depended. When apologies did emerge, they left me feeling as though everything was my fault, that I was the one causing harm, even tormenting her. I often felt worse after the apology than before it. After years of effort, an apology to my wife and I finally came. Then, several years later, during a family lunch, she leaned in and spoke so only I could hear. "By the way, I never said those things to your wife. You did." My father did not hear it. I immediately left, devastated that the apology we'd fought so hard for could be undone so easily, the pain returning at once. Once again, the narrative had been quietly altered, and I was repositioned as the source of the problem. Recast both as a terrible son for leaving the table and as mentally unstable. Before I had the language for narcissistic abuse, I told her she was living a false reality, that her life might be easier if she allowed truth to exist alongside it. She responded with hours of distress, positioning herself as the injured party, while I sat quietly with my father. We didn't engage. And eventually she returned composed and told me I was right, and that she was proud of me. But the next day, the narrative had shifted. I had been cruel, I had caused suffering, I had subjected an unwell woman to unnecessary pain. This pattern extended beyond my marriage into other areas of my adult life. When 2 female backing singers left my band, the event was reinterpreted not as a professional or interpersonal change, but as evidence that I was a woman hater. When my marriage ended, I went to see my parents for consolation. I was distressed. My mother responded, "Of course she left you. You told her you didn't love her anymore," and asserted that she had witnessed this, something I understood to be inconsistent with my experience and is experienced as another form of gaslighting. Act 5, becoming a father. When my daughter was born, something shifted in me. For the first time, I understood unconditional love, not as an abstraction, but as a lived responsibility. That experience reframed my own childhood. It clarified that what I had endured was not merely conflict, unpredictability, or family difficulty. It was patterned harm. I resolved that the cycle would end with me. This was not symbolic, it required action. While my daughter was still young, I began limiting her exposure to my mother. At the time, I did not yet have the full vocabulary I use now: narcissistic injury, projection, coercive control, intergenerational trauma, but I recognized their effects as part of a broader intergenerational pattern of coercive and relational harm. The shift began at her birth. When my wife asked for time and boundaries, my mother responded with an ultimatum, just like the Queen of the Night. If she's not allowed immediate access, she would disown me. As I say, this echoes with the Queen of the Night's command that her daughter kill Sarastro, the leader of the Temple of Wisdom, or be disowned. In Mozart's opera, maternal authority becomes coercion. Love is made conditional, and obedience is secured through the threat of abandonment. The command matters less than the structure it reveals, a demand that collapses autonomy by binding identity, loyalty, and survival to compliance. This pattern extended beyond me. My mother went on to threaten my daughter in similar ways, raising eviction when she was staying with her, or disinheritance if she did not return after moving out. My father, too, was repeatedly threatened with divorce. The parallels with the Queen of the Night and with coercive control more broadly are clearly defined. In this sense, the parallel is not literal but structural. What appears as maternal intensity is organized as control, a demand framed as necessity and backed with the withdrawal of relationship. The violence lies not only in what is asked, but in the conditions that make refusal unthinkable. We allowed contact later, when my wife felt ready, and the moment itself passed without incident. But when my wife calmly asked her for an apology to the threat to disown me, the familiar pattern reasserted itself. Denial, deflection, and reinforcement. My father supported her as he had before. She would never say that. Even the language was dismissed. She doesn't know those words. As though disbelief itself were treated as evidence. It's quite funny that he said she didn't know those words. They are actual words in the Queen of the Night Aria. I wish I'd thought of that at the time. The conflict escalated into a public confrontation outside our home. My mother's distress became theatrical. She collapsed, appearing to faint or fall ill. My father rushed to her, turning his anger towards me, accusing me of cruelty towards a vulnerable, unwell woman. The focus shifted, as it always had. What had been said no longer mattered. The preservation of her position was all that mattered. In the aftermath, the implications became clear. We kept our daughter away for several years, and I've never regretted that decision. When contact resumed, it was limited and supervised. During this period, my parents travelled abroad and recast us to our European family and friends as withholding and cruel, triangulating the narrative through them, an inversion that reframed our protection as harm. At the same time, my father attempted to grant my mother sole power of attorney without my knowledge and without revoking the existing joint and several arrangement under which I had been appointed. Our decision to limit contact was repeatedly interpreted in increasingly distorted ways. When we kept our daughter away, my mother claimed that I had adopted strong political positions and was turning against my parents, comparing me to some children in the United States who had, encountered rejected families over ideological differences. The specificity was less important than the structure. A protective act was recast as betrayal. One moment crystallized the pattern. When my daughter was 5 or 6, she proudly showed my mother a photograph she had taken. She said, look, Grandma, look how beautiful you are. The response was immediate and cutting. My mother shouted, "How horrible you are for making me look so old and ugly!" What should have been an affirmation was redirected into self-concern. The child absorbed the impact. I removed my daughter from her presence immediately. The moment mattered not only because it was unkind, but because it confirmed continuity. What I had experienced was not confined to the past. It remained active, capable of reappearing, now directed towards the next generation. My father's response was to maintain the familiar equilibrium, behaving as though nothing had occurred. Silence functioned as compliance. Such dynamics rarely persist in isolation. They rely on those who, whether out of fear, loyalty, or habit, sustain them by refusing to name what is happening. That too was part of the pattern. What I had once endured backstage was now attempting to recruit another generation into the same performance. Act 6. Allegations and narrative inversion. The first allegation marked a new stage. In one instance, my mother claimed that I had harmed my child while I was attempting to enforce boundaries that she would not allow. A claim that, if believed, could have destroyed my reputation and my career. The police investigated and found nothing to substantiate it. There was nothing to find. Yet even unsubstantiated allegations inflict damage. They destabilize identity, contaminate relationships, and introduce suspicion into every subsequent interaction. In the aftermath, I avoided contact with my parents for several years, fearing further allegations of a similar kind. My father supported my mother, and as a result, I lost significant time with him. When I finally felt able to visit in her absence, I was shocked by how much he had deteriorated. I was heartbroken, not only by his decline, but by the time lost between him and my family, including my daughter. The absence was later reframed against me. My mother characterized my distance as estrangement, and claimed that my return was motivated by financial interest, specifically that I had reappeared only in anticipation of inheritance. The inversion was complete. Later events followed a familiar sequence. We were with my father at the nursing home. My mother chastised me for crying at the realization that he was dying, and then a sustained barrage of negativity began. I initially tried to disengage, focusing on reading emails rather than responding, which was interpreted as avoidance, and when I interpreted to re-engage, I was interrupted and spoken over. As I withdrew again, I tried to block her out by putting in my AirPods and playing loud music. She escalated, threatening. So I understood it, to have my power of attorney revoked, a move that would have compromised my ability to support my father's care. My response was emotional and reactive, but it was separated from its context and reframed as the primary act of aggression. She slapped me across the face, echoing earlier experiences from childhood. I reacted reflexively, striking back. There was pushing and shoving, but the altercation ended without serious injury, and we parted as though nothing had occurred. Days later, she reported to police that I had assaulted her, that I had bloodied her nose, beaten her, and kicked her while she was on the ground. These allegations were investigated and, to my knowledge, were not substantiated, and my father witnessed the incident and attested to what had occurred. In the moment itself, I remember turning to my father, trying to reach him to be heard, perhaps for the first time, in the presence of what had shaped much of my life. Then I turned to my mother, attempting to confront her directly. "Look in my eyes," I said. She couldn't meet my gaze. Instead, she laughed and described me as evil. These episodes can be interpreted as reactive patterns within coercive control frameworks, in which sustained provocation elicits defensive responses that are subsequently reframed as primary aggression within broader patterns of coercive control and narrative distortion. My mother told my father, "You must choose, him or me." If he chose me, she would no longer come to see him in the nursing home. Even then, I understood I had been placed inside a conflict that did not belong to me, a dynamic consistent with triangulation and coercive ultimata, in which relationships are reorganized through forced loyalties and the threat of withdrawal. A similar pattern emerged in later confrontation over finances. When I challenged the transfer of their joint funds into an account that I understood to be controlled solely by my mother, she denied the transaction, which I believed to be supported by the records available to me. She then accused me of transferring the funds into my own account and questioned my mental capacity by invoking my history of OCD, and lunged towards the phone in my hand, striking at it. In the course of this escalation, my already frail father was injured during the incident. The event was witnessed and reported within the care setting, yet attention quickly shifted away from the harm itself and towards her visible distress. Her accusations functioned as more than deflection. They constituted a reversal I came to understand as defensive projection. The scenes were repeatedly rewritten after the fact, with roles reassigned. This was not impulsive, but followed a discernible structure. I observed a shift in how others responded to me following my mother's accounts of events, reflecting a long-standing pattern in which the shaping of narrative extended beyond the family into institutional spaces. Where I had previously been respected by staff at the nursing home and the bank, the perception changed after her interventions. The same shift occurred in relationships with extended family and long-standing family friends. In response, I began documenting everything, not as escalation, but as necessity. Documentation became a means of preserving continuity in a context where events were repeatedly denied, minimized, or rewritten. Act 7, the decline of my father. My father's decline began gradually and became impossible to ignore. Hospital admissions, falls, weight loss, including frailty and cognitive deterioration. He needed care, consistent, practical, sustained. For the first time in his life, he asked me to help with his finances and care situation. I rearranged my work, I deferred my PhD, and stepped into a role that had long existed only as a possibility, the son who protects. My involvement, however, was not received as support. It was treated as a threat. Control extended into every aspect of care: finances, access, communication, documentation, and authority. Money needed for his well-being was contested. My role in decision-making was challenged. Items I purchased for him were removed or discarded. Institutions, professionals, and administrative pathways became sites of conflict. Efforts I made to support him in his final months were repeatedly blocked, undermined, or reversed. This extended to the most intimate aspects of his final days. At one point, when my daughter sought to stay overnight to be with him, my mother reacted with visible distress, shouting that he loved his granddaughter more than her and insisting that she leave. What might otherwise have been a quiet moment of presence at the end of his life instead became contested. Even here, proximity, who was permitted to be with him and for how long, was not usual but regulated. What emerged was not a new pattern, but a familiar structure expressed under conditions of dependency and vulnerability, where isolation, fear, and dependence became organizing features. At times his voice echoed hers. He told me I was only coming to help him for financial gain or out of guilt for having been bad. I understood these statements as not his own conclusions, but as narrative he had absorbed and repeated. Even so, hearing them remained painful. Within this period, something in my father began to shift, and he spoke with a clarity that had not been available before. He told me plainly that he had always been afraid of her, alongside his regret for not protecting me, and his trust in me. In his final months, he attempted to correct what he could, writing statements, signing documents, and altering arrangements within limited time and capacity. For the first time, he was no longer speaking from the old script. In this context, coercive control becomes even harder to identify when overlaid with aging, illness, family roles, and dependency. As dependency increases, dynamics that had long operated interpersonally become more embedded within formal structures of authority. These words and actions did not undo the past, but they altered its meaning. He had been unable to stand up for the truth for most of his life, mine or my daughter's, prioritizing peace over confrontation and expecting me to endure and forgive. Yet in those final months, I felt for the first time that he had. During this final period, I was unable to attend my father's last birthday, an absence that remains difficult to reconcile. Coffee. The war over power of attorney. Power of attorney was not simply a legal instrument. Within this family system, it had become a symbol of control. In the context of coercive control, legal processes can themselves become instruments of domination, where procedural mechanisms used to extend control and credibility disputes into institutional settings. My mother could not tolerate the possibility that anyone else, particularly me, might be recognized for helping him or holding authority over my father's care. As his needs increased, legal mechanisms became tools in the struggle. She engaged a solicitor, challenged documentation, made allegations, and attempted to revoke my authority, using what I understood to be their joint funds, which I believe should have instead been directed towards his care. My own use of funds was directed exclusively towards my father's care, and to my knowledge was supported fully by documentation and receipts, together with my father's written consent authorising my financial decisions in my role as power of attorney. The pattern extended into external relationships. A friendship with a friend of my mother's, it broke down, and she attributed it to some sort of religious exclusion. Yet this interpretation appeared to follow an incident in which she had claimed that that friend had witnessed my father signing over his finances to her during a phone call to the bank. This illustrates a broader mechanism of narrative inversion in which disputed actions are reframed as victimization, preserving credibility while displacing responsibility. What had once been managed through voice and presence now extended into institutions, documents, and authority. My father's bank responded differently. It recognized the validity of the arrangements I had put in place. It reimbursed the expenses connected to his care and communicated with clarity and respect. This was not merely administrative. It revealed a contrast in institutional function, showing how some systems, through inaction or deference, enable harm, while others interrupt it through recognition. While family and friends within our social circles remained silent despite my repeated requests for help, individuals with no prior connection stepped forward. In practical ways, they ensured that my father lacked nothing. Their support stood in stark contrast to the silence of those closest to him. The struggle was no longer solely interpersonal. It had entered the machinery of the system itself. Act 9, the harm extends to the next generation. As my father's illness progressed, my daughter became more involved in supporting me as I tried to care for him. This too provoked my mother's hostility. What had once been directed towards me began to shift towards her. One moment marked this clearly. My daughter had proudly shown my mother a photograph of the massage chair I had arranged for my father's comfort with the support of his bank. What should have been a gesture of care once again became a point of tension. My mother entered my daughter's locked room, physically restrained her, and left a note conditioning forgiveness on an apology. My daughter called my father and I, after locking herself in the bathroom, fearing for her safety. My father responded with empathy but was unable or unwilling to act. The invasion of her space, the use of physical force, and the manipulative demand, framed in the language of apology and forgiveness, were not aberrations. They were continuities. What I had experienced in childhood was not confined to the past. It was recurring, now directed toward the next generation. What had unfolded in one generation was beginning to extend into the next. Medical opinion indicated psychological distress consistent with coercive abuse, aligning with research linking coercive control to significant mental health impacts, including trauma and anxiety responses. And this harm extended beyond discrete incidents. It included threats, eviction, disinheritance, and conditional support, designed to maintain control. In response, I secured independent housing for my daughter and reported concerns to the police. I realized then that survival within such a system is not the same as safety from it. I might endure it, my father might endure it, my daughter should not have to. Breaking the cycle, therefore, ceased to be symbolic. It became immediate and non-negotiable. Act 10. The night he chose us. When my daughter and I entered the room on his final night, he passed away gently in our presence, not in drama, not in fear, not in confusion, but in the quiet company of those who loved him without condition. I do not claim certainty about another person's inner life at the point of death, but I know what that moment meant to me, and the history from which it emerged. For a man who had spent so many years placating, apologizing, shrinking, and surviving, that final stillness felt like something more than peace. It felt like an act of agency, a quiet correction. In that final moment, the queen of the night no longer controlled the scene. Postlude, peace. As I began to recognize patterns in my mother's communication, her control over the narrative began to weaken. Once named and challenged, the mechanism began to fail. She disengaged, moving the conflict into legal channels, and to my understanding using their joint funds, which in my view should have been supporting my father's care, to oppose my involvement at a time when his needs were increasing. Before he died, with the help of his bank, I was able to restore his access to their joint account, which, as I understood at the time, he had not been able to access freely for the preceding few months. To mark the moment, he chose to give his granddaughter a final gift of $50. Considerable resources were then, in my understanding, directed toward legal opposition. Even this small act of care became contested. I also required access in order to carry out my duties as power of attorney, which in my experience my mother had sought to restrict. Here the pattern was visible in miniature. Death did not end the story, it clarified it. Despite all the documentation, witness accounts, medical context, and legal processes, institutional responses remain fragmented or deferential. Emotional abuse leaves no visible mark. Coercive control rarely appears in single divisive record. It is distributed across time and context. I was unable to attend my father's funeral. I chose not to place myself or his memory within what would likely become confrontation. A recorded message was played, inaudible and cut short. Over time, I severed contact with those under my mother's influence to prevent further harm mediated through them. Within coercive systems, isolation is not incidental but functional. Narrative capture can recruit bystanders into reinforcing the dominant account, turning them into unwitting amplifiers of harm. This is central to this memoir, not only that narcissistic parental abuse carries harm or causes harm, but that it persists through failures of recognition. Institutions respond to incidents. Coercive control operates through continuity. Breaking it is not a single act, but a series of choices. Boundaries over guilt, truth over silence, protection over compliance. It is less dramatic than imagined and more painful. The loss of once treasured relationships is real, necessary, even when it comes with a quiet but essential relief. My father was unable to break the patterns for most of his life, but in his final moments, and especially in his final months and in his final moments, he chose differently. He chose trust over fear. That didn't erase the past, but it altered what followed. Near the very end, I tried one more time to make peace with my mother. She responded, as she always had, with a long message outlining all the good things she'd done for me, paying for my music lessons, helping my wife and I buy our first home. I replied with something I had only just come to understand, that I was grateful for what she had given me, but that didn't give her the right to treat me badly. Her response was musical and sarcastic. Variations on the theme, she said. I was completely devastated, because even as my father was drawing his last breaths, she maintained the same narrative structure, one prioritizing image, justification, and her self-presentation over relational repair or empathy, consistent with patterns in which narrative is reshaped to preserve self-image while disregarding the emotional reality of others. No amount of keeping my child away for years or the impending death of my father could disrupt that structure. The absolute absence of empathy I experienced within these dynamics was not incidental but systematic, reflecting a profound impairment in recognizing and responding to the emotional needs of others. His last words to her were simple: peace, peace, peace. I do not hear them as a plea, but as a resolution. He had long accommodated conflict he could not safely confront. In the end, he named something beyond it. Whatever form that peace took, his final moments altered the trajectory I inherited. From that point on, peace was no longer something to wait for, but something I would have to choose. Coda. Now with zero contact from my mother, distance brought clarity. With guidance from a psychologist and time for reflection, what once felt confusing resolved into identifiable patterns: contradiction, deflection, inversion, and the displacements of responsibility. This process did not create new events. It clarified those already experiences. Messages that once carried emotional authority lost their force when examined structurally rather than absorbed. As my position shifted from internalizing meaning to analyzing it, the mechanism failed. What had once operated as a system of control no longer held. In the aftermath, I sought not only understanding but connection. I established a peer support group for those affected by narcissistic parental abuse, particularly in adulthood. Its purpose is relational, not therapeutic or legal, a space where patterns can be recognized without dismissal, and where lived experience does not require defense. What is shared there is often not rare, but rarely recognized. Naming does not resolve harm, but it changes the conditions in which it operates. What was once private becomes legible. This memoir is not revenge. It is an effort to tell the truth with care and to give language to what might otherwise remain unnamed. The truth my father struggled to speak, the truth my daughter needed protection from, and the truth I spent a lifetime trying to understand. What was once lived as reality can now be understood, at least in part, as performance, and now it can be seen. I will not have contact with my mother again. I have learnt to accept the loss of a relationship that at times felt caring, even happy, while recognizing that those moments existed within a pattern I did not then understand. I no longer expect change, remorse, or empathy. What I experienced was not incidental, but consistent with patterns described in the literature, the prioritization of self-image over relationship, and a limited capacity to recognize or respond to the emotional reality of others. For me, that has meant accepting that reconciliation is neither possible nor something I seek. That recognition is difficult and necessary. Some forms of harm do not disappear. They must be named and prevented from repeating. That's where freedom begins. I have felt anger and grief, often for what was absent, and relief. At times something like pity, not as absolution but as recognition that I would not want to live within that structure. Relationships structured by harm do not produce singular emotions. Where attachment, fear, obligation, and injury coexist, so do the responses. What becomes possible instead is recognition. I would not want to live as she did. Harm occurred regardless of justification. My responses were adaptation, not pathology. And what I feel reflects what was lived, not my character. In opera, the queen's power depends on belief. Outside it, that belief is no longer required. There are two sides to every story, except in narcissistic dynamics, where there is the story and the lived truth. And when the performance ends, only reality remains. No costume, no stage, no audience, only the reckoning. I'd just like to finish by saying that for those seeking a space where similar experiences can be recognized and shared, the peer support group is available. Look, it's a peer-led support space. We don't provide medical, psychological, or legal advice, but if you look us up on Facebook, and certainly if you contact me, I can give you the link. So once again, it's the Sydney Survivors of Narcissistic Parental Abuse Support Group on Facebook, and feel free to get in touch. I can send through the document, as I said, and there are all the references and citations that can be verified or even researched if you want to do further reading. Thank you for listening. Hope some people find some, I guess, comradeship if they've experienced the same thing, and that you're not alone. You're not the only one. I thought I was the only one, but there are millions of people, probably since time immemorial, who've had a narcissistic parent. Thank you, and take care.